Jason Carter adjusted the straps of his gear pack as he walked along the rocky cliffs of Ganymede's Amethyst Sea. It had been a long day cataloging plants in the colony's biodome, and he needed a breather. The alien moon's horizon glowed with hues of purple and gold as the twin suns began to set. Waves from the luminescent sea crashed below, their radiant light reflecting off the jagged cliffs. Jason took a deep breath, letting the surreal beauty wash over him. Just as he started descending a narrow path, a faint, high-pitched scream broke through the steady hum of waves. He froze, his eyes scanning the horizon. The sound came again, desperate, frantic. Someone was in trouble. Jason sprinted toward the sound, heart pounding. Near the edge of the cliff, he spotted a figure flailing in the glowing water below. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. The figure was humanoid, but its skin shimmered with a pearlescent glow, and long tendrils of translucent hair floated around it like waves of light. An alien. Jason didn't hesitate. He dropped his pack, secured a climbing rope to a nearby rock, and descended as fast as he could. The currents in the Amethyst Sea were notoriously unpredictable, and even strong swimmers could be pulled under in moments. The figure's struggles were weakening. Jason's boots splashed into the water as he reached the shoreline. Without a second thought, he dove in, the frigid liquid shocking his system. The sea's glow surrounded him, making the alien girl's silhouette easier to spot. "Hold on," Jason yelled, though he wasn't sure if she could understand him. He swam with powerful strokes, reaching her just as she began to sink. He grabbed her arm and pulled her to him. Her large, luminous eyes widened in fear, but she didn't resist. "Got you," Jason murmured, keeping his grip firm. He kicked hard, fighting the current to get back to shore. The water seemed to push back against him, almost alive in its resistance, but Jason refused to let go. After what felt like an eternity, he stumbled onto the rocky beach, dragging the alien girl with him. He collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, his body trembling from the effort. The girl coughed violently, expelling water from her lungs. Jason sat up, taking a closer look at her. She was small, barely reaching his chest in height, with delicate features and skin that shimmered like polished opal. A faint scar ran along her forearm, contrasting with her otherwise flawless appearance. Her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, her wide eyes darting around as if expecting something or someone. "You're safe," Jason said softly, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. The alien girl stared at him for a moment, her expression a mixture of confusion and fear. Then she spoke, her voice melodic but trembling. "Thank you, human." Jason blinked. Her grasp of English was surprising, though her accent was unlike anything he had heard before. "You speak English?" She nodded hesitantly but didn't elaborate. Her eyes kept flickering to the cliffs above them, as if she expected someone to appear. "Are you hurt?" Jason asked, gesturing to her arm. The girl shook her head. "No, just afraid." Jason frowned. Something about her demeanor unsettled him. She wasn't just scared from nearly drowning. She was terrified of being found. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Erika," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. "Erika, I'm Jason," he said, trying to reassure her. "What happened? How did you end up in the water?" She hesitated, her luminous eyes locking onto his. "I ran away." Jason raised an eyebrow. "From what?" Before she could answer, a low, distant hum filled the air. Jason's eyes shot to the sky. A sleek, silver craft appeared, its lights scanning the cliffs and sea. Erika's entire body tensed. "They're coming. We need to hide." Jason's instincts kicked in. He grabbed his pack and helped Erika to her feet. "Follow me," he said, leading her toward a narrow crevice in the cliffside. As the craft's searchlights grew brighter, Jason realized he had just stumbled into something far bigger than a simple rescue. Jason crouched behind a jagged rock formation with Erika, his breath shallow as the searchlights from the alien craft swept across the cliffs. The low hum of its engines reverberated through the air, setting his nerves on edge. Beside him, Erika trembled, her iridescent skin dimming as if she were trying to make herself invisible. "Stay quiet," Jason whispered, though he doubted she needed the reminder. The craft hovered for a moment, its lights lingering on the shoreline where Jason had pulled Erika from the water. Then, with a faint whir, it turned and disappeared over the horizon. Erika exhaled sharply, her body slumping against the rock. Jason took a moment to study her. Even in the dim light, her alien features were striking. Large, luminous eyes, a slender frame, and skin that shimmered with a pearly glow. She looked fragile, but there was something in her gaze that hinted at hidden strength. "Who were they?" Jason asked once the craft was out of sight. "My people," Erika murmured, her voice barely audible. "The Xenelians. They're looking for me." Jason frowned. "Why? What did you do?" Her head snapped toward him, eyes wide with a mix of fear and defiance. "I didn't do anything. I'm considered flawed." Jason blinked. "Flawed? What does that even mean?" Erika hesitated, as if weighing whether to trust him. Finally, she held out her arm, revealing the faint scar Jason had noticed earlier. "This," she said quietly. "In Xenelian culture, any imperfection, no matter how small, is unacceptable. They say it's a sign of weakness, a defect that must be removed from society." Jason stared at her, disbelief mixing with anger. "They're chasing you because of a scar. That's insane." Erika nodded, her expression grim. "It's not just the scar. They believe I carry a genetic anomaly. To them, I'm not worth keeping alive. They wanted to dispose of me, so I ran." Jason's jaw tightened. He had read about the Xenelians in colony briefings, a highly advanced but secretive race that rarely interacted with humans. They were known for their perfectionism, but he hadn't realized it extended to such extremes. "Well, they're not getting you," Jason said firmly. "Not while I'm around." Erika's eyes widened. "You would risk your life for me? A stranger?" Jason shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "It's what humans do. We look out for each other, or anyone who needs help." For a moment, Erika simply stared at him, as if trying to understand this alien concept. Then, to his surprise, she smiled, a small, hesitant curve of her lips that seemed to brighten the dimness around them. "Thank you," she said softly. Jason stood and offered her a hand. "Come on. We can't stay out here. That ship might come back, and I'm guessing you don't want to be found." She nodded and took his hand, her touch cool and surprisingly light. Together, they climbed the narrow path back toward Jason's outpost. The outpost was a modest structure built into the cliffs, designed for humans studying Ganymede's unique flora and fauna. Jason led Erika inside, locking the door behind them. The space was small but functional, a bed in one corner, a workstation covered in equipment, and shelves lined with samples of glowing plants. "You can stay here for now," Jason said, motioning to the bed. "It's not much, but it's safe." Erika looked around, her eyes lingering on the plant samples. "You study this world?" she asked. Jason nodded. "I'm a botanist. I catalog plants, study their properties, and figure out if they can be useful for medicine or food." Erika picked up a vial containing a glowing blue liquid. "This is incredible. Your kind values discovery and knowledge." Jason chuckled. "We try, though some of us just like playing with cool plants." Her smile returned, a little brighter this time. "It's different. The Xenelians value perfection above all else. Creativity and curiosity are seen as distractions." Jason frowned. "That sounds boring." Eureka laughed, a soft, melodic sound that made Jason grin despite the tension. "You're not wrong," she said. Suddenly, a red light blinked on the console near the door, accompanied by a soft chime. Jason's stomach dropped. The motion sensors outside had detected something or someone. He turned to Eureka, his expression serious. "Stay here. Don't make a sound." Her smile vanished, replaced by a look of fear. "Are they here?" Jason grabbed a small plasma cutter from his workstation, his heart pounding. "I don't know, but if they are, they'll regret coming." As Jason crept toward the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far more dangerous. Jason pressed his back against the wall near the door, plasma cutter gripped tightly in his hand. The motion sensor outside had gone off twice now. Something, or someone, was definitely out there. Erika watched him from the corner of the room, her luminous eyes wide with fear. She looked so small and vulnerable, curled up on the edge of his bed, clutching a blanket as if it could shield her. Jason gave her a reassuring nod. "Stay quiet. I'll check." Slowly, he activated the external monitor. The screen flickered to life, displaying a grainy image of the rocky terrain outside his outpost. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the jagged cliffs and the faint glow of the amethyst sea in the distance. Then, a shadow shifted near the edge of the screen. Jason squinted. Two figures stepped into view, their silhouettes tall and sleek. Their movements were fluid, almost unnatural, and their glowing armor reflected faintly in the moonlight. Senelians. Jason's grip on the plasma cutter tightened. "They found us," he muttered under his breath. Erika gasped softly. "How? I thought the craft left." "They must have scanned the area before they flew off," Jason guessed. "And now they're here to finish the job." The figures outside began moving toward the outpost, their heads turning as if scanning for signs of life. Jason felt his pulse quicken. His outpost wasn't built for defense, just survival. If they tried to break in, it wouldn't take them long. "Do they have weapons?" he asked Erika, keeping his voice low. She nodded. "Yes. Energy-based. Very powerful." "Great," Jason muttered sarcastically. "Anything else I should know about them?" "They'll try to take me alive," she said, her voice trembling. "They want to make an example of me. But if they think you're helping me—" She hesitated, her glowing skin dimming. "They'll kill you without mercy." Jason glanced at her, his jaw tightening. "Then we make sure they don't get the chance." The Exenelians reached the door, their movements precise and methodical. One of them pulled out a sleek device, pressing it against the door's lock. Jason could hear the faint hum of the mechanism as it began overriding his security system. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. There had to be a way to outsmart them. Humans weren't as advanced as the Exenelians, but they had one advantage: ingenuity. "Do they have weaknesses?" he whispered to Erika. She hesitated, then nodded. "Their armor. It's designed for energy attacks, not physical ones. If you can catch them off guard." Jason glanced at his cluttered workstation, an idea forming. He grabbed a heavy metal wrench and a small vial of acidic extract he'd been studying from one of the native plants. "I'll handle this," he said. "If something happens to me, take the back exit and run." Eureka's eyes filled with panic. "Jason, you can't." "I'm not letting them take you," he interrupted firmly. "Now stay out of sight." The lock on the door clicked, and the metal panel slid open with a hiss. The first Senelian stepped inside, its glowing eyes scanning the dimly lit room. Jason pressed himself against the wall, wrench in one hand and the vial of acid in the other. The alien advanced, its sleek armor gleaming faintly. Jason waited until it was fully inside, then swung the wrench with all his strength, aiming for the gap between its helmet and chest plate. The impact made a sharp, metallic clang, and the Exenelian staggered, letting out a distorted cry. Jason didn't hesitate. He smashed the vial of acid against the exposed section of its armor. The substance hissed and bubbled, eating away at the material. The Exenelian collapsed, writhing in pain. The second alien rushed in, raising its weapon. Jason dove behind his workstation as a beam of energy sizzled past, scorching the wall. "Eureka!" he shouted. "Get out of here!" But instead of running, Eureka stepped forward. Her hands glowed faintly as she reached for a control panel on the wall. Jason had no idea what she was doing, but a moment later, the lights in the outpost flickered, and a low hum filled the air. "What are you?" Jason began, but Eureka cut him off. "Distract them," she shouted. Jason grabbed a nearby chair and hurled it at the second Xenelian. The alien dodged, but the brief distraction gave Eureka enough time to finish whatever she was doing. A sudden burst of energy erupted from the panel, sending a shockwave through the room. The Xenelian stumbled, its weapon clattering to the floor. Jason seized the opportunity, tackling the alien to the ground and pinning it with his weight. Breathing heavily, he looked up at Eureka. "What did you do?" She smiled faintly, her glow returning. "Disable their armor systems. It's temporary, but it should give us time to escape." Jason and Eureka sprinted through the rocky terrain behind the outpost, their breaths heavy in the crisp Ganymede air. The faint glow of the amethyst sea lit their path, but shadows danced ominously along the cliffs. Every sound seemed magnified. The crunch of gravel beneath their boots, the faint hum of the wind, and their racing heartbeats. Jason glanced back to ensure the Xenelians weren't following yet. "You sure their systems are down?" he asked, panting. Eureka nodded, her glowing skin dimmed from exertion. "The disruption should hold for a few minutes, but they'll recover quickly. We need to keep moving." Jason nodded. Survival was his only focus now. As they climbed a narrow ridge leading deeper into the cliffs, a distant rumble shook the ground. Jason froze, steadying himself against the rock wall. Eureka's luminous eyes widened, and she grabbed his arm. "That's not them," she whispered. Before Jason could ask what she meant, the sky above them erupted in a cascade of fiery light. A massive ship, black and jagged like a predator's fang, descended from the clouds. It was not Xenelian. Its engines roared like thunder, and its exterior was covered in menacing spikes that glowed with crimson light. Jason's stomach twisted. "What the hell is that?" Eureka's face paled. Dralcor raiders. They're scavengers, violent and ruthless. They must have detected the Xenelian ship and decided to attack. Jason cursed under his breath. He had heard of the Dralcor in colony briefings. They were infamous for raiding outposts, taking hostages, and stealing resources. If they were here, things had just gone from bad to worse. The Dralcor ship hovered over the cliffs, its massive shadow blotting out the light of Ganymede's twin suns. Suddenly, smaller craft detached from its underbelly, swarming like angry hornets. They descended rapidly, their engines screaming. Jason grabbed Eureka's arm. "We need to find cover. Now." They scrambled down the ridge, seeking shelter in a narrow cave hidden beneath an overhang. The cave was small, barely large enough for the two of them, but it provided a view of the chaos unfolding outside. From their vantage point, they saw the smaller Dralcor ships landing near Jason's outpost. Raiders in dark, spiked armor spilled out, their movements fast and aggressive. They carried strange, jagged weapons that crackled with energy. The Xenelians had recovered and were engaging the raiders. Bright flashes of energy lit up the cliffs as both sides exchanged fire. Jason watched in grim fascination as the sleek, calculated movements of the Xenelians clashed with the brutal, reckless attacks of the Dralcor. "This is bad," Jason muttered. Eureka hugged her knees to her chest, her glow faint and flickering. "The Dralcor won't stop until they've taken everything. The Xenelians are strong, but they're outnumbered." Jason frowned, his mind racing. He wasn't a soldier, but he had survived enough scrapes to know when the odds were stacked against him. If the Dralcor raiders got past the Xenelians, they'd come looking for other targets, like him and Eureka. "We can't just sit here," Jason said, his voice firm. "What can we do?" Eureka asked, her voice trembling. Jason glanced around the cave, his gaze falling on a cluster of glowing plants growing along the walls. Their bioluminescent leaves pulsed faintly, a natural energy source Jason had studied during his time on Ganymede. An idea sparked in his mind. "These plants," he said, pointing to them, "they produce a volatile chemical when exposed to heat. I've used them to create small explosions during experiments." Erika tilted her head, her fear momentarily replaced by curiosity. "You're saying we can use them as weapons?" Jason nodded. "If we can rig them to detonate near the Drow core, it might slow them down. It's not much, but it's better than nothing." The two of them worked quickly, gathering as many of the glowing plants as they could. Jason used strips of fabric from his pack to bundle them together, creating makeshift explosive charges. Erika, her natural dexterity evident, helped secure the bundles with careful precision. Once they were ready, Jason peered out of the cave. The battle between the Xenelians and the Drow core was still raging, but the raiders were gaining ground. "We'll aim for their supply drop zones," Jason said. "If we can disrupt their resources, it might give the Xenelians a chance to push back." Erika nodded, determination flashing in her eyes. "I'll follow your lead." Jason smiled faintly. "Stick close, and if things go south, run." Jason and Erika darted through the rocky terrain, their breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. The fiery glow of the Drow core explosions lit up the cliffs behind them, casting long shadows as chaos unfolded. The raiders shouted in a guttural language, their heavy boots pounding the ground as they gave chase. "This way," Jason yelled, tugging Erika toward a narrow crevice in the rocks. They squeezed through the jagged opening, the sharp edges tearing at Jason's jacket. The space was tight, barely wide enough for them to pass, but it offered temporary cover. Jason held his breath as the sound of the Drow core grew louder. He glanced at Erika, who crouched beside him, her iridescent skin flickering faintly like a dim beacon. "Stay quiet," he whispered. The raiders' footsteps stopped just outside the crevice. Jason's heart pounded so loudly he feared they would hear it. One of the Drow core let out a guttural growl, and Jason could see the faint red glow of their armor through the narrow crack in the rocks. For a moment, it felt as if time had frozen. Jason gripped the plasma cutter in his hand, ready to fight if they were discovered. But then, to his relief, the raiders moved on, their voices fading into the distance. Jason exhaled slowly. That was too close. Erika nodded, her luminous eyes filled with fear. "They're relentless. If they find us..." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Jason placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure something out. We always do." They emerged from the crevice once the coast was clear, carefully navigating the uneven terrain. Jason knew they couldn't keep running forever. The Drow core were too well equipped, and their numbers were overwhelming. "We need a plan," he said, scanning the area. Erika's gaze lingered on the horizon, where the massive Drow core mothership loomed like a dark shadow. "If we can destroy their command center, it might force them to retreat," she said hesitantly. Jason raised an eyebrow. "Destroy their ship? That's ambitious." "It's their lifeline," she explained. "Without it, they'll be stranded here, and the Xenelians can overpower them." Jason frowned, considering the idea. It was a long shot, almost suicidal, but it made sense. Taking out the mothership would cripple the raiders and give them a fighting chance. "All right," he said finally. "But how do we get close enough? That thing's crawling with guards." Erika hesitated, then reached into a small pouch at her side. She pulled out a spherical device, its surface smooth and glowing faintly. "What's that?" Jason asked. "A Xenelian disruptor," she said. "It emits a short-range EMP pulse strong enough to disable small systems. If we can plant it on the ship's power core, it might be enough to overload it." Jason stared at her in disbelief. "You had that this whole time." She gave him a sheepish look. "I didn't think we'd need it. It's risky. If the pulse doesn't destroy the core, It will only disable their defenses for a few minutes. Jason sighed. Better than nothing. Let's do it. Getting to the mothership was no easy task. Jason and Erika moved under the cover of darkness, avoiding patrols and sticking to the shadows. The closer they got, the louder the hum of the ship's engines grew, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. When they finally reached the base of the massive vessel, Jason stared up at it, a mix of awe and dread coursing through him. The ship was enormous, its surface bristling with weapons and glowing vents. There, Erika whispered, pointing to a maintenance hatch near the bottom. We can get inside through that. Jason nodded, and they crept toward the hatch. Erika worked quickly, using the disruptor to override the lock. The hatch hissed open, revealing a narrow corridor bathed in red light. Inside, the air was thick and metallic, the walls lined with pipes and glowing panels. Jason's pulse quickened as they moved deeper into the ship, every step bringing them closer to danger. The day the Drell Corps launched their final assault arrived faster than Jason had expected. The skies above Ganymede were filled with the shadows of their massive ships. Jason and Erika stood side by side, their expressions hardening. They knew this battle would be different. This was no longer just about defending the outpost. It was a fight for survival. The Xenelians, though weary from previous battles, were ready. The outpost had been fortified with new defenses, but Jason knew it wouldn't be enough to stop the Drell Corps entirely. They needed to be strategic, hit the enemy where it hurt most, while protecting their vulnerable areas. We can do this, Jason said, his voice steady. We've got one chance to turn this around. We make it count. Erika glanced at him, her glowing eyes reflecting the tension in the air. Let's make sure they regret ever coming to this moon. The Drell Corps ships descended rapidly, their weapons charging with deadly force. The first wave of attackers landed near the outskirts of the base, and without hesitation, the Xenelians began to fire back. The ground shook as explosions rocked the surface, sending dust and debris into the air. Jason and Erika moved quickly, their bodies trained for combat. Jason was armed with his plasma cutter, and Erika wielded her energy blades, her movements swift and precise. They fought alongside the Xenelian soldiers, each one determined to push the invaders back. The Drell Corps were relentless. Their weapons were powerful, and their soldiers were ruthless. But Jason had fought enough battles to know that determination and strategy could sometimes tip the balance. They couldn't match the Drell Corps' strength head-on, but they could outsmart them. Focus on their commanders, Jason shouted to Erika, who nodded. She moved like lightning, cutting down Drell Corps soldiers as she approached the enemy leaders. Jason followed her, doing his best to hold off the advancing troops. The battle raged on, and despite the Xenelians' best efforts, the Drell Corps kept coming. Jason's arms ached from swinging his plasma cutter, and his eyes burned from the smoke in the air. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. Not when everything they had fought for was on the line. Erika's energy blades hummed with power, and she was a blur of movement as she cleaved through the Drell Corps ranks. She was more than a fighter. She was a symbol of hope for the Xenelians. Jason saw the soldiers' eyes follow her as she moved, their morale lifted by her presence. We need to break their command structure, Jason said to her as they moved through the battlefield. If we can disrupt their leadership, the rest will fall apart. Erika nodded. She didn't speak. She never needed to. Her actions spoke louder than words. She dashed forward, cutting through the Drell Corps soldiers, making her way to the enemy's command post. Jason followed her, fighting his way through the chaos. The sounds of battle filled the air, blasts of energy, the roar of weapons, the cries of soldiers. Jason could feel the weight of every step, but he kept pushing forward. They couldn't afford to lose now. When they reached the command post, Erika wasted no time. She disabled the Drell Corps' communication system, effectively cutting off their ability to coordinate. It was a crucial move, and Jason knew it would give them the upper hand. The Drell Corps, disoriented and unable to regroup, began to falter. The Xenelians, seeing their opportunity, pushed harder, driving the invaders back. The ground trembled with the force of the battle, but there was a shift in the air. The tide had turned. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the Drow Corps retreated. They had underestimated the strength of the Xenelians and the unexpected power of their new allies. Jason stood, panting and covered in dust, looking out over the battlefield. The Xenelians were victorious, but at a great cost. Erika stood beside him, her expression as calm as ever despite the chaos. "We did it," she said softly. Jason looked at her, feeling the weight of the battle settle on his shoulders. "For now," he replied. "But we've just proven something important. We can win this. We'll be ready for whatever comes next." As the Xenelians celebrated their hard-won victory, Jason and Erika shared a brief moment of silence, knowing the war was far from over. But for the first time, they were certain they had a fighting chance. After the battle, the outpost on Ganymede was quieter than it had been in weeks. The Drow Corps had retreated, but no one believed for a moment that they were gone for good. Jason and Erika stood together, watching the horizon. The sky, once filled with the shadows of enemy ships, was now calm. But the calm felt uneasy. "We've won the battle, but the war is far from over," Jason said quietly. His voice carried the weight of everything they had just survived. Erika stood next to him, her glowing skin reflecting the fading sunlight. She nodded in agreement, her eyes scanning the horizon. "The Drow Corps will return," she said, her voice steady, but filled with a hint of sadness. "They always do." Jason sighed, knowing she was right. Even after the success of their final assault, the Drow Corps were relentless. They would regroup, rebuild, and strike again, and the cycle would continue unless something changed. But what could they do? "We need to prepare," Jason said, turning to look at her. "Fortify the outpost. Train the soldiers. And we need more weapons, better ones, if we're going to stand a chance against them next time." Erika glanced at him, her expression calm. "I've been thinking the same thing. The Drow Corps are powerful, but they have weaknesses. We can exploit them, but we need more resources and more time." Jason agreed. They had barely enough time to recover from the last battle. The Xenelian soldiers were exhausted, and the outpost needed repairs. But there was no time to waste. The Drow Corps wouldn't wait for them to rest. Over the next few days, Jason and Erika worked together to improve the defenses of the outpost. They studied the Drow Corps' movements, trying to predict their next steps. The Drow Corps were cunning, and they wouldn't make the same mistakes twice. Meanwhile, Jason also spent time with the Xenelian soldiers. They were strong, skilled, but they needed more training, more preparation. Jason helped them improve their combat techniques, focusing on strategies to fight the Drow Corps' advanced technology. He knew they couldn't match their firepower directly, but they could use their agility and teamwork to their advantage. Erika's role was just as important. She spent hours with the Xenelians, teaching them her people's techniques. Her energy blades were unmatched, and she showed them how to use precision strikes to disable their enemies without overwhelming them. She was a natural leader, and the soldiers respected her more than words could describe. Despite the tension in the air, there were moments of peace. Jason and Erika would sit together at the edge of the outpost, watching the stars, talking about their lives before the war. Erika would tell stories of her homeworld, a peaceful place full of beauty and calm. Jason would share stories of Earth, of his family, of the simple joys of life before the war had torn everything apart. In those moments, Jason found a sense of hope. He realized that, no matter how hard the battle, it was these connections, these shared moments, that would keep them going. He had never imagined he'd find himself fighting alongside an alien in a war to protect a distant moon. But Erika had become more than just an ally. She had become a friend. But the calm, as they both knew, was temporary. The Drow Corps would not give up. They would return, stronger and more determined. And when they did, Jason and Erika would be ready. As the days passed, the preparations continued. Jason worked late into the night, never allowing himself to rest for too long. The weight of the future pressed on him, but he didn't allow himself to give in to fear. There was too much at stake. The outpost, the Xenelians, and Ganymede itself. Everything depended on them. One evening, as the sun began to set, Jason stood by the communications panel, scanning for any signs of the Drow core. But there was nothing. The moon was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. "We need to stay vigilant," Jason said, looking over at Erika. She nodded, her gaze never leaving the sky. "Vigilance is our only chance, but we will fight together, and that will make us stronger." Jason felt a surge of gratitude for her words. He had never believed in the power of teamwork so strongly until now. With Erika by his side and the Xenelians at his back, he felt ready to face whatever was coming next. But even as he stood there, he knew one thing for certain. The storm was coming, and when it did, they would stand together, no matter what. The days after the battle were filled with hard work. The calm that had followed the Drow Corps' retreat was like the silence before a storm. Jason knew that time was running out. Every moment spent rebuilding, training, and strategizing was a step closer to the inevitable return of the Drow Corps. Jason and Erika had become more than just allies. They had become a team. Their bond was forged in battle, and together they led the effort to prepare the outpost for what was to come. But the task wasn't easy. The Drow Corps' next move could come at any time, and they needed to be ready. Jason worked with the Xenelian soldiers, teaching them combat strategies, sharing his knowledge of Earth's warfare tactics. They practiced in the open fields around the outpost, honing their skills. Every soldier, human and Xenelian alike, knew the next battle would be tougher. They couldn't afford to make mistakes. Erika spent most of her time working on the technological aspects of the outpost. She knew that their weapons and defenses needed to be upgraded to match the Drow Corps' advanced technology. The Xenelians had strong tech, but the Drow Corps' weaponry had outclassed them before. Erika worked tirelessly, upgrading the shields and modifying the energy cannons. Her people's knowledge of energy manipulation was invaluable, and her ingenuity gave the outpost a fighting chance. One evening, after a long day of preparation, Jason and Erika sat together at the edge of the outpost, looking out at the distant horizon. The stars were beginning to appear, and the quiet of the night contrasted sharply with the chaos of the past few weeks. "We've done all we can," Jason said, his voice tired but determined. "Now we wait." Erika nodded. "We can only prepare ourselves for what's to come. We know the Drow Corps will return, but we are ready." Jason looked at her, sensing the weight of her words. They had done everything they could, but no matter how much they prepared, there was always the unknown, the unpredictable nature of war. "I wish we could be sure of our victory," he said quietly. "I wish the same," Erika replied. "But in a war, there is no certainty, only the fight and the strength to keep moving forward." Jason smiled at her words. They weren't just preparing for battle. They were preparing for the unknown. The fight was about more than just weapons and strategy. It was about their will to keep going, no matter the cost. The days turned into weeks, and tension in the outpost grew as they awaited the Drow Corps' next move. Jason continued to lead training drills, focusing on teamwork and communication. The Xenelians were quick learners, but Jason pushed them to be faster, stronger, and more precise. The Drow Corps had no mercy, and they couldn't afford to hesitate. Erika, too, pushed herself harder. She continued to improve the energy systems, and her focus on efficiency and strength kept the outpost's defenses sharp. She spent hours working alongside the soldiers, teaching them how to fight using their surroundings to their advantage, making sure they understood the importance of strategic defense. Despite all the preparation, a feeling of unease settled over Jason. Every day felt like they were waiting for a storm that would never come. But in his gut, he could feel it. The Drow Corps were out there, and they were planning something bigger. He didn't know when they would strike, but he was certain they would return with even more force than before. One evening, Jason was alone in the communications room when a signal flashed across the screen. It was faint, scrambled, but there was no mistaking it. The Drow Corps were sending a message. He quickly activated the receiver, listening intently as the distorted words came through. "Prepare for annihilation," the message echoed, chilling Jason to the core. He turned to Erika, who had been working nearby. Her face was as serious as his. "They've come for us," she said. "We're not ready for what they have planned." Jason felt his heart race, but he refused to let fear take hold. "Then we'll make sure they know what they're up against. We fight. We fight for everything." Erika gave him a steady look. For everything. And with that, the calm was shattered. The storm was no longer just a feeling. It was a reality. The Drow Corps were coming, and it was time to face them, head-on. They had prepared as best as they could, but now it was about survival. Jason, Erika, and the Xenelians were ready for the fight of their lives. They had no choice but to stand their ground, because if they didn't, there would be nothing left to fight for. The moment had come. The Drow Corps had returned, and they were not alone. Jason stood at the command center of the outpost, his eyes fixed on the monitors as enemy ships filled the sky. The Xenelian soldiers had gathered, preparing for the worst. Everyone knew this was it, the final fight for Ganymede. Jason felt a tightness in his chest as he looked over the faces of the soldiers. They were exhausted, battle-weary, but there was something else in their eyes. A fire, a determination. They had fought too hard to give up now. "We can do this," Jason said, his voice strong, but not without a trace of worry. "We've prepared. We've trained. We fight together, or we fall together." Erika stood beside him, her energy blades glowing at her sides. She didn't speak, but her presence was all the answer Jason needed. She had always been calm, focused, and now, more than ever, she was a symbol of hope. The Xenelians respected her deeply, and Jason could see the soldiers looking to her, finding strength in her unwavering determination. The Drow Corps ships loomed overhead, casting long shadows over the outpost. The time for waiting was over. Jason knew the enemy would strike hard, with everything they had. But the Xenelians had a secret weapon, courage, and the will to protect their home. Jason stood at the front of the group, his hand on the weapon he had used in every battle, the plasma cutter. It had served him well, but today it would be different. The fight would be much bigger than anything they had faced before. The Drow Corps were not going to just land outside the walls this time. They were coming to wipe them out, and the Xenelians knew it. "Position yourselves. Stay in formation," Jason ordered. The soldiers scrambled to their positions, their weapons ready. Every soldier knew that the outpost's defense systems would be crucial. Erika had worked tirelessly to improve the shields, but there was only so much they could do. The first wave of Drow Corps ships descended like vultures, releasing countless dropships that rained down on the surface of Ganymede. The sound of their landing was deafening. The battle had begun. Jason and Erika moved swiftly, leading the charge. The Xenelians opened fire, their energy cannons lighting up the darkened skies. The blast sent shockwaves through the air as the Drow Corps ships retaliated. The ground shook as explosions rocked the surface. "Keep them off the perimeter," Jason shouted, rallying the soldiers as they fought to hold back the enemy forces. Erika was already in the thick of the battle, her energy blades cutting through the Drow Corps like a whirlwind. Jason joined her, his plasma cutter humming as it sliced through enemy armor. The Drow Corps were powerful, but they weren't invincible. The Xenelians had learned to fight smarter, using the environment to their advantage. The Drow Corps fought ruthlessly, pushing forward in waves, but the Xenelians refused to give up. Jason felt a surge of pride as he saw the soldiers working together, flanking their enemies, coordinating their attacks. It wasn't just about weapons. It was about unity, about fighting for something greater than themselves. "We can push them back," Jason shouted. "Don't let up." Erika was everywhere at once, her movements so fast that she seemed like a blur. The Drow Corps soldiers fell before her with each precise strike. Jason watched her in awe for a moment, but there was no time to be distracted. He turned back to the battle, using his cutter to slice through the enemies in his path. But the Drow Corps were relentless. The more they pushed, the more Jason realized they were testing the Xenelians' defenses. They were trying to find a weakness, and it wouldn't take long for them to succeed. Jason's gut told him that the battle wouldn't last long if they didn't change their tactics. "Erika, we need to disable their command ship," Jason called over the comms. She nodded, understanding immediately. Without hesitation, she darted toward the center of the battle, cutting her way through the Drow Corps soldiers to reach their leader. Jason followed closely, doing his best to clear the way. Together, they reached the command ship's landing zone. The Drow Corps' leader was there, overseeing the attack. Jason and Erika knew that if they could take him down, the rest of the enemy forces would lose their coordination, giving the Xenelians the chance they needed to win. With a single synchronized strike, Erika and Jason brought down the Drow Corps leader. The sudden chaos in the Drow Corps ranks was immediate. Without their commander, the remaining forces scattered, retreating into the sky. Jason watched as the last of the Drow Corps ships disappeared. The battle was over. The Xenelians had won.